Hello everyone and welcome to Logic Games Step by Step. I'm Michael Deere and this brief tutorial is a quick introduction to the analytical reasoning section of the LSAT, also commonly known as logic games. If you're just beginning your prep for the LSAT, or if you have discovered this weird section of the test and want to know more, then this is the introduction for you. So let's get started. This is a logic game, or rather, it's an example of a logic game, similar to what you might encounter on the test. We'll get into the specifics of the game in a little bit, but let's take a minute to familiarize ourselves with what you're going to be asked to do. Every game will give you a series of rules and conditions governing some specific scenario, like delivering packages, or in the present case, seating wedding guests at different wedding tables. Using these rules and conditions, you will have to draw inferences that help you determine what must be true as well as what could be true about the specific scenario that the game gives you. All of the reasoning that occurs in a logic game is deductive reasoning. And deductive reasoning is a type of reasoning that allows you to reach logically necessary conclusions from a given set of conditions. It's the type of reasoning most people think of when they hear the word logic. Whenever people talk about logical reasoning or whether an argument is valid or not, they most often have in mind deductive reasoning. So let's look at a really simple example. Suppose I were to make the statement, if I want to go to law school, then I must take the LSAT. And suppose I were to add to this statement, I do want to go to law school. Then I would be compelled by logical necessity to draw the conclusion that I must take the LSAT. This is an example of deductive reasoning. And in this type of reasoning, if the first two statements are true, then the third statement has to necessarily be true as well. On its face, we can immediately see that this conclusion has to follow if these two premises are true. So let's go back to our logic game and take a closer look. What we want to do now is identify the types of information that are common to all logic games. And no matter how weird or how unusual the logic game, it still has to give you this information, one way or another. The first piece of information that the logic game will provide is the situation. All logic games are situated in relation to some everyday scenario. In the present game, the situation is that of seating wedding guests at wedding tables. But it really could be anything. It could be deliveries throughout the week, books being reviewed by different editors, or even the order of singers performing in a concert. Whatever it is, every logic game is going to have this connection to some real-world situation. Doesn't really contribute anything, but you can often use it as a helpful guide when you're making decisions about other pieces of information in the game. The second piece of information is what I'm going to call the static variable. It's this part right here. This is the variable in the game that will never change. It is always fixed and immovable. In our logic game, the static variable is obviously the wedding tables. Stage table, left table, right table. So our static variable is what we're going to use to place the other variables in the game. And it's often going to be the very first thing that you want to identify, since it's going to be the variable around which you're going to organize all the other variables. This is one place where the everyday situation of the game can help you, because many times the static variable for the game is going to have an intuitive connection to that everyday scenario. And just like here, wedding tables are an obvious choice for our static variable because the tables don't move. The third piece of information is what I'm going to call the dynamic variable, and these can be found here. If your static variable never moves, the dynamic variables always move, and these would be like your game pieces. These are the things that are going to move around the board, and just like with our static variable, your everyday scenario can help you identify what these are. It's generally going to be pretty intuitive. In our present example, it's already obvious that the wedding guests are going to be our dynamic variable. But the easiest way to identify them is usually just by looking for the variables that are all grouped together like these are right here. And even better, the dynamic variables often have an alphabetical or a nearly alphabetical order, just like here. And this makes it easier to identify them and easier to record them, since we can simply write the letters out for each variable instead of writing out the names. The fourth piece of information that the game must give you is the type of relationship that will define the game. And here, you kind of catch a break, because the LSAT only recognizes two types of relationships: ordering relationships and assignment relationships. In other words, any logic game is going to ask you to either order variables in a sequence or assign them into different groups. Sometimes you will encounter games that ask you to do both, and every game is going to ask you to do one or both of these. There are no other types of relationship that you're going to encounter in a logic game. So we can see in the present game that we're being asked to assign variables rather than order them. We're not putting guests in first, second, third place, and so on. We're grouping them together in sets of 3 around each table. So what we're being asked to do is assign guests rather than order, and we know the type of relationship that we're going to be using. An ordering game, on the other hand, typically looks something like this, and this is an example of an ordering game similar to what you might encounter on the LSAT. And as you can see here, the static variable is always going to be whatever sequential thing is being used to order the other variables. This is why some students tend to find ordering games just a little bit easier, because the static variable is usually much more quickly identifiable, because you can just look for whatever variable is in sequence. All right, so let's go back to our original logic game. So we have the everyday situation of the game. We have our static variable, the wedding tables. We have our dynamic variable, the wedding guests. And we know what it is that we're being asked to do. We're being asked to assign rather than order. So now we come to our final piece of information. The last thing that the game will give you is what I call players to positions. In our game, the players to positions is pretty straightforward. We have 3 tables, and each table can seat 3 guests. So that gives us a total of 9 seats. When we look over our dynamic variable, we see that we have exactly 9 guests. So we know that each guest is going to be seated at exactly 1 table, and so 9 guests, 9 seats, our ratio is exactly 1-to-1. So our players to positions is essentially 1. For each seat, there's a single guest, and we don't have any leftover guests, and we don't have too few guests. Everything matches up. But in a lot of games, they're not equal. Sometimes you might have, say, 11 guests for 9 seats, and you've got to figure out who has a seat and who does not. Or you might have 7 guests for 9 seats, and you've got to figure out which table does not have a guest. This type of inequality between the players and the positions is a huge driver of complications in a game, and a lot of information can be drawn from that relationship of players to positions. So it is something that you absolutely have to pay attention to, because where the players to positions are not equal, that inequality is often highly impactful on the other rules and conditions of the game. So be sure that you do record that information. So let's review. Every single logic game has to give you these 5 pieces of information. And for every single logic game, you're going to want to record this information in one way or another. And those 5 pieces of information are the situation, the static variable, the dynamic variables, the type of relationship, and the players to positions. Once you have these pieces of information, you can turn to the rules. So let's do that now. The rules are easily identifiable because they will always be grouped under the initial paragraph, and because, well, they're rules. In any logic game, the rules are going to tell you how that game is supposed to be played. So what the rules are going to do is give you conditions that can't be violated, and they'll give you information that will allow you to deduce other important rules that you're going to find helpful when you're answering questions. But here's the thing. Yes, it's true that the rules impose conditions on the game, but remember what we said at the beginning. All of the reasoning in this section is deductive reasoning. So what the rules really do is state unambiguous logical relationships. Every rule expresses a logical connection between some of the variables. And this means that understanding the rule means understanding the specific logical relationship that the rule is giving you. This is where the magic happens in the game. But it's also where disaster strikes. Because a lot of times the rules are going to be written in confusing ways, or in ways that attempt to obscure the logical relationship that they present, or sometimes the rules will give you a counterintuitive logical relationship that's different than what you might expect. And sometimes, if you don't have that basic grasp of logic that you need, then it's going to be easy to mislead you about what a rule actually means. So this isn't the place to go over all the rules in a detailed way, but I would like to demonstrate some of the pitfalls and challenges that you might encounter just from how the rules tend to appear in a logic game. Let's start with the last rule in our game, and that rule states that Daryl is not assigned to the stage table if Ken is not assigned to the stage table. If we have even a passing familiarity with conditionals, then we'd probably just rewrite this rule as follows. If Ken is not assigned to the stage table, Daryl is not assigned to the stage table. And we might diagram it something like this. But often the LSAT will complicate simple conditionals like this by using everyday language that is hard to translate or that maybe just isn't familiar in terms of its logical meaning. So for example, we might write the rule this way. Ken is assigned to the stage table unless Daryl is not assigned to the stage table. And this way of writing the rule is actually logically identical with the original stated rule. But it's just phrased in a different way, a more confusing way. And if we don't understand the logical relationship implied by the word unless, we might be misled about the rule. Other times, the test is going to phrase rules in absolutely the most confusing way possible, even though the meaning of the rule is straightforward and simple. So for example, we might have a rule that says P is either before R or before S, but not both. And it looks confusing, and it's written in a confusing way. But the meaning is pretty obvious. P has to always be between both R and S, but it doesn't matter what order R and S are in. So if we were to draw a visual representation, it might look something like this. And you can see that we're just placing P between R and S where we don't know. R could be first, S could be first. All that matters is that P is not before both of them. But these are just some of the ways that the rules can be a minefield. And it highlights the importance of understanding basic logical relationships as you turn to the rules portion of a game. So we've now gone over the different parts of a logic game. And the next thing to cover is what we do with all of this information. And the answer to that question is what I cover in the next few tutorials, where I talk about how to diagram logic games and how to draw inferences in a logic game to help you answer questions. But before we end this tutorial, I just want to leave you with a few parting thoughts. The first is, don't be afraid of logic games. Even if you've never had a formal introduction to deductive reasoning, it's still something that you already do every day. You draw inferences from information all the time, and you reach logical conclusions based on that information all the time. The difference is that most of the time it's such a familiar process and it's so obvious that you don't even think about what you're doing in terms of deductive reasoning. For example, I know that if my wife is home, then her car will be in the garage. And so I also know that if her car is not in the garage, she's not home. This is intuitive and it's obvious, but it's also a specific rule of deductive reasoning, namely that any stated conditional has a contrapositive. And I don't think about it in those terms when I'm making that kind of inferential judgment. It's just something I do because I think it would be hard for us to get through a day if we didn't do that. And so even if the reasoning you're going to encounter in a logic game is formalized and somewhat rigorous, it's not any different than what you already do every single day. You just haven't formalized what you do every single day because it's obvious and it's familiar. So take heart from that. The second thing I want to say is that mastering logic games is a skill. It's not an art. It does not require any special faculty on your part. There's no gene in your DNA that makes you better at drawing inferences and reaching logical conclusions. This is not a process that requires inspiration or creativity. It just requires practice, time, and familiarity. And like any skill, it has to be learned. And there is a learning curve, but mastery is also fairly easily achievable. So believe it or not, and this is the third thing, when it comes to logic games, you actually have the advantage because logic is a finite domain and the logic games are a very closed universe. And there's a fixed set of rules that will always stay the same. So there's no ambiguity at all. You're told exactly what you have to do, and you're told how you have to do it. And in addition, there's only two types of relationships, ordering and assigning. And all of this adds up to the realization that at a certain point, patterns are going to start to repeat. Rules are going to start to repeat. There's nothing new to learn. So once you master these rules, and once you master the relationships of ordering and assigning, that's really it. So that no matter how weird or unusual the game, it still has to follow the same rules that you've already learned and are starting to see as repetitive as you practice. So you have the advantage because once you understand those rules, you're going to be able to understand any logic game that you see. Patterns are going to have to repeat. Game types are going to have to repeat. And the more logic games you do and the more familiarity you develop, the easier those games will become. That's why it's often recommended that you complete a game over and over again until you understand the rules and conditions behind the game. because the more you do that, the more you're going to realize how repetitive these rules and mechanisms really are. And personally, I think it's taking the long way around. I think there are easier ways to get that level of mastery, and part of that is what I'm going to show you in these tutorials, but it will get you there, and it will make you better at logic games. So lastly, try to have fun. Once you have enough practice, you may even find logic games enjoyable. Many of my students report that when they actually do take the LSAT, the logic game section is their break section. It's the section where they feel like they're able to relax a little bit, have what passes for fun when you're taking the LSAT. And it's sort of a break for them before doing the more difficult sections, or a break from those sections. And they often tell me before taking the test that they've come to find logic games enjoyable and fun. So hopefully you will too. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and good luck with your prep.